Good evening and welcome. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speak, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Knowing that this conversation is being watched in every Australian state, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which people are watching this. I am very excited about tonight and a little bit jealous. I'm excited because I, along with so many of you, have been prevented from going to Israel this year due to COVID-19. And so tonight we'll have Tuvia whet our appetite for when we finally get to return to Israel. And I'm jealous because Tuvia, as well as Sefi, our moderator tonight, undertook the official tour guide course in Israel, which is an amazing course that teaches you absolutely everything about the land of Israel. And it was a course that I had aspired to do one day when I used to live in Israel. Now, before I introduce Tuvia, I do want to tell you that this time next week, we'll be speaking to Jordana Cutler. Now, she is the head of policy for Israel and the Jewish diaspora at Facebook. So that will be a very fascinating conversation. We'll be speaking about all sorts of things, notably the many anti-Semitic and anti-Israel type comments that one finds on Facebook. So Dr. Tuvia Book lived in the UK and South Africa before making Aliyah. After serving in the army and going to uni, he spent time in the US, both working at an Israeli consulate and also as a Shaliach. He returned to Israel and became a tour guide after taking the course that I mentioned, but Tuvia wasn't done yet. He did a PhD looking at the impact of the birthright tours on Israeli soldiers and has written 2 books, one examining the moral dilemmas of Israeli soldiers and another a curriculum book on Zionist history. His 3rd book, coming out next year, is about the Second Temple period, which is also one of my favorite parts of history. So I'm looking forward to reading that book when it does come out. Tuvia will be speaking tonight with Sefi Shalam. Sefi is Shaliach for the Netzer movement here in Melbourne, where I speak as well. And he has spent a good part of his career involved with youth engagement activities. He's also done the tour guide course, of which I am jealous, and he became a father for the first time 13 days ago, for which massive congratulations, Sefi, and thank you for taking time out of this time in your life to speak to us for this hour. So Tuvia and Sefi tonight will be speaking about all the places we should visit Israel when we're allowed to back, but also about how youth movements in the diaspora, spending time in Israel, impacts both Israelis and the diaspora, and thus the Israeli diaspora relationship. That is something I am particularly looking forward to. So without further ado, I will pass the conversation over to you, Sefi.
Thank you, Toda Rabba, Bren. First, I'll mention 2 things. Yes, our baby Tomer is celebrating his bar mitzvah only in days today. So if you hear a cry in the background, I'm sorry, we tried our best. And also, I'll just mention that the course that I did to be a tour guide is very different to the one that Tuvia did. He's superior to me. I did the one that allows me to take Israeli groups to travel abroad. I wish I could do, just like Bren wishes, I wish I could do the one that Tuvia did that allows you to take groups in Israel, and we'll speak about it in a moment. So Tuvia, I want to start, as Bren mentioned, South Africa, Israel, US, UK. Why all the frequent moves, and are you now in Israel to stay?
Hello, everybody. Okay, so after Bren's introduction, you won't be surprised to be hearing my pommy English. The introduction is pretty simple. It's basically till I was 17, I never actually had a name. My name was just the rabbi's son. So I'm actually a PK, which is a preacher's kid. They even wrote a song about me. It's called The Son of a Preacher Man. So until I was basically finishing high school, we were just wandering Jews, and my father's going to different rabbinical postings, and no one really asked me. We were just following him. So for example, I was born in the UK in London, but when I was 3 months old, we moved to South Africa for my father's position as a rabbi in the community, first of all in Port Elizabeth, and later on in Durban. And in between, we were in the UK once in the north of England, in the place Lancashire, which explains why I support Liverpool, which are the best football team in the world. And later on in Cardiff in Wales, a little bit that sticks out of England, not New South Wales. And then when I was 17, I came to Israel for a gap year with my youth movement, with Bnei Akiva, with a program called Hakshara, with MTA. And I met a lot of Israelis in that year, which we'll talk about later. And that convinced me to stay in Israel and do something called a program called a Machal, which means Mitnadrei Chutz La'aretz, which is to stay and do a military service as a lone soldier, as a Chayal Boded. And I stayed, and the rest is history. I've been to the States a couple of times professionally, both as a Shaliach for the Sochnut, for the education department, and also as a Shaliach for Misrad HaBitachon, which is working for the Israeli Defense Ministry, which I can't tell you too much about. And then afterwards, I did my PhD in the States as well. So I've been backwards and forwards. Right now I'm in Israel, in sunny Modi'in, a place they call Makom Tov Be'emsa, a good place in the middle. So I am the traditional wandering Jew, in case you were wondering.
Thanks, Tuvia. Yeah, definitely interesting, all the different moves. There was a recommendation that you try to sit a bit more still so we don't hear your sound moving, but whatever works for you. So my next question to you is, what is the one place that you keep wanting to return to? And what is the one place that you call home?
Well, home is where the heart is. The famous poet Yehuda Halevi said, Libi b'mizrach, my heart is in the east, in this case in Israel. So home is definitely Israel. But if I wasn't a frothing at the mouth Zionist, I would definitely, I'm not saying this just because it's you guys, would choose Australia. I definitely have what they call a country crush on Australia. I've been quite a few times to Australia, and whenever I come back, I'm always waxing lyrical about it to such an extent that my friends have to shush me up. So Australia is definitely a very close number 2, but nothing replaces Israel.
Yeah, so actually that was my next question. How many times have you visited Down Under? And my next one would be a tricky one. What's your favorite place in Australia? I would never say mine, because I'm a Shaliach now, and it will forever haunt me if I say mine.
So Australia, I'm actually very fortunate. I'm a double-digit Australian. The first time I came to Australia was 2006. I was invited to be a keynote speaker at the ZFA Educators Conference, the biennial conference in 2006. And in fact, the lady who called me up, who was then the president of the ZFA, she originally was from Durban in South Africa. And she said, excuse me, are you the rabbi's son? And I'm like, wow, no one's called me that since I was a kid, because she knew our family in South Africa. And that was actually a very interesting visit because it was the summer of 2006. So I was invited, first of all, to speak for 2 days at the conference. And then I was supposed to spend 2 weeks going around to different cities in Australia to where there are day schools, in Sydney and Perth and Melbourne. And promote my new book, which I just written as a Shaliach, called For the Sake of Zion, a curriculum on Israel Zionist education. However, literally after being in Australia for 2 days, I got a phone call from my brother in Israel, and he said, you got a Tzav Shmona, which anyone who's been in the military in Israel will know is an emergency call-up. So I obviously thought he was joking because I was so excited to come to Australia, you know, and he said, I'm not joking, turn on your radio. And I listened, and it was the Second Lebanon War. And so after 2 days of my first visit in Australia, after flying all those hours, I got hopped on a plane and flew back again. Then the next visits were a bit less dramatic. And so every year since 2006, I've been coming to Australia, either for ZFA conferences or for various schools I've been teaching at in the various cities. As for my favorite place, so we've got this rivalry, which I'm very well aware of, between Sydney and Melbourne. And I've also been to some other lovely places outside of Sydney and Melbourne, such as Western Australia, with a lot of people from Durban, and Brisbane, and lots of hiking. So I'll just have to, as they say in the United States, plead the fifth on this one, because I do not want to upset anyone. So I'm going to gracefully decline to say my favorite place, just to say that I love Australia and I love the lifestyle, and I've been really blessed. I've been there 11 times so far.
Yeah, it's you got out of it very well diplomatically, I think. So now let's jump straight into your work as a tour guide, and this will be the first half of what we'll speak about. and then afterward we'll speak a bit about your research about the Greek birthright. When and how did you become a tour guide? Did you start working at it straight away? I know, just like me, there are thousands of Israelis who have some kind of a tour guide certificate that they've never used. So how did you come about to actually working in it, and what brought you into it?
Well, what's interesting is that as I mentioned, I grew up in a Zionist youth movement called B'nai Akiva. In South Africa, when I was a kid, people didn't say, do you go to a Zionist youth movement? The question was which one you go to, because we all went to one. It was just part of our life, whether it was Habo or B'nai or Beitar, whichever one it was. So we all went to a Zionist youth movement. And I grew up, I started as a chanich, as a participant, and later on I was a madrich, I was a counselor. And after that, I was a Rosh Shiva, which is a regional regional head. And we grew up teaching. We grew up, first of all, as a participant, and later on as a counselor. And when I was in the army in Israel, I was in a unit called Givati, which is called Chativata Sgula, which is a part on the Chosen Brigade, but also on the Purple Brigade, because we had purple berets. And my task was to be a Chovesh Kravi, which is a combat medic. So basically, I went and did this medics course in the army in IDF, which lasted me for many, many months. And one of the advantages of the course, besides learning life knowledge, is the second you finish the army, you actually have a job. So as soon as I finished the army, I did two things. I worked as a medic on ambulances with the Magen David Adom. I also worked, most interestingly, as a medic with tour groups, with youth groups touring Israel. I remember sitting in the back of the bus with all my experience in Hadracha and guiding and teaching my Chanichim and B'nai Akiva, hearing these Israeli tour guides, no offense, Sefi, with these incredible thick accents, guiding desperate children, saying, when I was in the army, we used to, how you say, okay, everybody, look out of the chalon and you see, and I used to think, wow, I could do better myself. So after the first summer of listening to these tour guides from the back of the bus, I decided, you know what, mate, I can definitely do a better job. And that's what prompted me to do the tour guiding course. But as you said, it's a long course. It took 2 years to do. Fascinating, amazing course, both because of the kinds of people who go to the course, young people who love Israel, and also older people who already have a life experience, who wanted a second career or just doing it for the sake of learning it. So we had all sorts of people, ranging from people who've just left the army, all the way through to the head of naval intelligence of the IDF, and just fascinating people. It's one of the most interesting courses I've ever taken, much more interesting than my PhD. And that's really what encouraged me to go, and I thought I could do better. And I also thought to myself, what a great way to earn a living. Basically, you're going around meeting people from all over the world, seeing wonderful sights, you're outdoors, you're not in an office from 9 to 5, and people actually pay you to do it. Like, how bad can life be?
Yeah, I actually did the same job that you mentioned before. I was security guard in trips, in school trips and birthright and things like that. And me and my friends, we used to have competitions called I Can't Believe I'm Getting Paid for That. And we would compete for the best things we get to do while someone is paying us. So for example, sitting in a jacuzzi or like going to an amazing show or live concert, and we're actually getting paid for that. So I definitely understand what you're saying. And actually, I want to ask you a tiny follow-up questions, because you've mentioned that you have different groups coming. Which ones do you prefer? The smaller boutique family trip or the big birthright or school?
Great question. So my default setting as a youth movement graduate and participant is definitely the educational big youth groups, the big birthright groups. I do like guiding families. In addition to families, I also guide, I've guided synagogue, shul tours and federation tours. And basically, I enjoy them both. The only problem with families, sometimes if you get like a dysfunctional family, you basically are stuck with them for a week or two. with a huge group, like 40 people on a birthright trip. If you get one or two, should we say, like odd eggs, you still got the other 38 you can focus on. So I don't know. I just, as an educator, I much more bond and gel with the big educational groups. Last year, for example, I just took a group from Melbourne, from the King David School. I was with them for a month. So if you're in a whole month with one group, you really get to know them. It was amazing.
Yeah, and I actually know the kids that you're speaking about, and I personally love them. This year group that you're mentioning. And then, by the way, you've mentioned that you grew up in youth movements in South Africa. There is, and I work for Netzer here, there is the eternal debate on where was Netzer established, in Melbourne or in South Africa. Of course, it was established in Melbourne, but our South African counterparts have different opinions. And then let's dive into one question that I bet people were waiting to hear some of your opinions about. So give me your three favorite places to travel in Israel, and one place which is a great place, but you're sick and tired of it. So I can tell you about myself. My wife and I, we had endless amount of overseas guests coming over when we lived in Israel, and we lived in Givatayim. And at a certain point, I told people, I'll drop you in the entrance to Old Jaffa, and I'll pick you up in the end. I'll tell you exactly where to go, but I can't go there anymore. So 3 favorite places and 1 place that you're sick of.
Okay, I'm going to flip onto a share screen here so I can show you a picture of them as well. So hold on 1 second. I was ready for this one. Hold on, guys. Okay, so this is favorite place number 1. And anyone who knows me will know this one coming up. Okay, can you guys all see that? So what you can see over here is the desert, right? And this is my favorite place. I mean, anyone who knows me will know this. What you can see over here is actually a group of mine, probably a birthright group, which I took walking single file in the desert. And now quite often when you take participants who grew up in urban environments, they've never been to a place where there's such a vastness and you feel so small, like a tiny cog in a vast eternal machine. And the peace and the quiet, whether at night gazing up to thousands and millions of stars, or during the daytime just hearing what Simon and Garfunkel called the sound of silence. So for me, definitely the desert. It's my number 1 by a mile. This happens to be this particular shot in the Judean desert, Midbar Yehuda, but also the Negev as well. So number 1, definitely the desert, without a doubt. I can talk much more about it. In fact, I can talk the entire hour about it. I'll give you guys a break there. And let's move on to number 2. So number 2 for me is definitely, here we go. Very different than the desert. This is guiding a group on the Golan Heights, Ramat Golan. And this is a huge contrast. On the one hand, I like the yellow and the brown and the peace and the quiet, but also in the Golan, especially in the winter, it is unbelievable. Or in the spring, the sea of wildflowers, the dark green. People say, but this doesn't look like Israel we see. Like, where are the camels? Where's the sand dunes? And Israel really is a world in one country where you could literally go skiing in the Hermon, and a couple of hours later, you can be lying on the Mediterranean beach working on your tan. And this particular picture you can see is actually in a place called Tel Goded, which is in Ramat Golan. This is the remains of a eucalyptus. You can see in the corner here, part of a eucalyptus tree, which should be very familiar with the Australian viewers. And this is a eucalyptus tree that's planted on top of a former Syrian bunker in the Golan Heights. And this, of course, connects to the Eli Cohen story. So over here, I am guiding a bunch of birthright participants in the Golan Heights, overlooking a kibbutz called Kibbutz Goded over here on the other side of the valley. So we've got these 2 contrasts. In the south, I love the desert. And in the north, I love Ramat Golan. And you talk about a place which you're kind of sick of, but is also my 3rd favorite place. Let me get there, coming up. And that is, just drum roll, this place over here. Now you might have heard of it. And that is Masada. Metzada. So Metzada, I don't even know how many times I've been there. I wouldn't be surprised if it's got 4 digits. It could have been over 1,000 times. Could have been. Definitely many, many hundred times. And you will notice my headgear. This is what I normally wear in the office, though, folks, in case you're wondering. This is my office attire. Another great reason to be a tour guide. You'll notice this hat over here, which I got in the Victoria Market in Melbourne. My famous Australia hat, good for all conditions, rain and sun, amazing. But just to show you that I'm not Australian, even though I love being Australian, I'm very proudly holding my Israeli passport over here, obviously in the middle of some guiding gig. So Masada is both a place I've been to a gazillion times, at least, I mean, even though one tends not to want to exaggerate, but also a place that just endlessly fascinates me. It always, even though I've been there so many times, for most of the groups, it's their first time, to see it through their eyes and the epic story and the story it has to tell is incredible. And with your permission, Sefi and all these lovely people in Australia listening in, I'd like to show a 1-minute film from Masada, actually guiding an Australian group. These are kids from students from 2 schools. One is Mariah in Sydney, and the other, interestingly enough, is called Masada, also in Sydney. And so you can hear Masada on top of Masada, but most importantly, the message of Masada, which for me is very important. And this is a couple of winters ago with a program called IST. And you can see both the Australians and myself getting very excited, being on top of Masada for 1 minute. It's basically us and a few birds. So let's pop over and have a quick 1-minute guided tour of Masada. And I think you'll all understand the appeal.
If you would have tapped a Roman soldier then on his shoulder and said, by the way, in 2,000 years' time, there'll be a group of students from Moriah and Masada, on top of Masada, praying in Hebrew, and the Roman Empire will be dust and ashes, what would that Roman soldier have done? He'd have a good laugh. He said, that can't be. We're the Roman Empire. We rule the world. And yet 2,000 years later, because of 3 things, we are back here. Our Torah, our community, and our love of our land. Imagine if we could skip back 2,000 years of history and tell the defenders your death is not in vain. And our message is going to be, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live.
This last one, I bet it's the oldest trick in the book for tour guides in Israel, right?
Never gets, never get tired of that one. Yeah, it's always a good one. If you listen very carefully, maybe you'll hear our ancestors from thousands of years ago responding to you. Wow.
It's interesting actually that you've mentioned Masada and the story about Eli Cohen and the eucalyptus trees, because there are more and more people who claim that the eucalyptus trees were there before Eli Cohen, and there are more and more people in Israel who now challenge the myth of Masada, and it's it's the classic saying about tour guides, like, don't ruin a good story with the facts. But I guess we don't have enough time to dive into it now, but for another conversation to speak about
I'm happy to address Masada. Basically in Hebrew, you have a phenomenon called lishbor et habitos, to break the myth, right? So you can go either way. On the one hand, you can stick to that old narrative and say, this is the story, what we learned in tour guide school, we learned for our youth group, and this is what happened, and it's a great story, and I'm going to tell it, damn it. Or the other thing you can do is say, wait a second, all this other new research has come in, so we're going to sit and we're going to break the myth and just pull it to pieces one at a time. So I like to find somewhere the middle path, and that is to do my own research and figure out exactly where we are with the story. So for example, with Masada, the big question is, how accurate was Josephus? Did the suicide happen? And what exactly is a symbol of Masada? Because Masada was always a great, especially for Zionist youth movement, was also a phenomenal symbol. When I first came to Israel, it was also a big symbol for the army. There used to be a lot of ceremonies of tekes hashpah, swearing in of the army and finishing the march. And now it's changed. We used to say, Shenit Masada lo tipol, which basically means Masada will not fall again. What I like to say is what we saw in the video, which is Am Yisrael Chai, which is not a message of death, but rather a message of life. So it all depends on, the site's still powerful. It's still the most visited site in Israel. There's still, just as purely from an archaeological moment point of view, there's phenomenal remains. The site is dramatic, it's stunning. The question is, what is the message all the time? Is it a place of death or a place of life? So I'd rather focus on the life and find the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. It's not either or.
Yeah, great. So with that, you obviously know a lot about Aussies and Aussie tourists and travelers to Israel. So an interesting statistics, I hope I have it right, is that about 30% of American Jews have visited Israel once in their life, and then 89% of Aussie Jews have visited Israel more than twice in their life. So our average viewer tonight knows a thing or two about Israel. Give us a place that you'll blow us off our feet, that none of us has thought about visiting in Israel. Maybe even two.
Okay, so first of all, you're saying about Australian Jews. What blows me away about Australian Jews is just how Zionist they are. I remember the first time I came for a ZFA conference. That's a word for our sponsors, folks. One of the things that amazed me is I was dealing with a bunch of teachers, educators from all the different day schools in Australia. And unlike Israel or the United States or basically anywhere else, they were all sitting in the same room and focusing on what they had in common, which is Ahavat Yisrael, or love of Israel. So whether they came from more traditional Orthodox backgrounds or religious liberal backgrounds or none of the above, whether they're wearing a ritual skull cap, a kippah, yidlid as we call it, or not, whether they had the women had their head covered or not, whether they're wearing skirts or jeans, whatever they were wearing, externally, internally, they said, we are all Jews and we're all here as educators and we're focusing on how to get Israel across to our students. So this love of Zionism and this love of Israel is something unique to Australia, especially the tolerance amongst educators and students, where they don't compartmentalize and say, well, I go to this shul or not, or don't go to shul at all, but rather we are all brothers and sisters. Kol Yisrael chaverim, arevim ze b'zeh. We're all responsible for each other, and we all love Israel, and we're going to focus on that. So that's definitely, that statistic doesn't surprise me, how attached physically as well as emotionally Australian Jews are to Israel. As far as off the beaten track places in Israel, there are many off the beaten track places. In fact, just a quick promo, a friend of mine, a South African born friend of mine, is also a tour guide called Shmuel Chantal and myself. We actually have a YouTube channel on Off the Beaten Tracks in Israel. You can look at the running tour guide or on YouTube, or you can look at myself, Tuvia Book, on YouTube. And you can see that basically every week or so, when we're free, we go to these off the beaten track places, either running or riding, and give you guys an extra view of them. And basically, I'm going to show you a couple. I'd be very surprised if any of you can pick up on these things. So let me go back to the shared screen again.
Challenge me.
And we'll see. This is your test, okay? So here is one. This is a good one. Let's see if any of you guys can get this one. All right. Where is this in Israel?
No.
And let's bear in mind, folks, that Sefi is an Israeli.
Yeah. No, it's either a church or a Byzantine, either a Byzantine church or an old synagogue. I would, maybe in Gamla?
Nope, no cigar for you.
In the Golan.
It's definitely the Golan. I think you can tell like it's got basalt over here, which is a volcanic stone, which is native to the Golan, as well as imported.
Is that the old, sorry for you abusing my mic privileges here. Is that the old Greek temple that's sort of halfway up, halfway up the hill on the way to that big old fortress, the Crusader Fortress. It's not the Crusader Fortress, but it's...
No, you're thinking of no,
yeah,
it's not.
But there's a Greek temple sort of on the side of the hill somewhere.
Yeah, you're thinking of Banyas. No, sorry. No, mate. Let me know when you're over, because this is painful for me. So let me know when you guys are finished.
No, go for it, go.
Okay, so in addition to the Golan stone, if you're just looking around, you can also see imported stone. This is red granite from Sinai and white marble from Carrara in Italy. You can see the bases of columns over here and the columns themselves. You can see they've all toppled to one side. Anyone who studied the history of Israel will know there was a massive earthquake in Israel in the year 749 CE. And you can see the result of it. But if you look in the background, you can also see vast other remains of other buildings and part of a Roman street or Ocado over here. This, my friends, is the site of Susita, known in Greek. Yes.
James and Carlil had it right.
Okay, Susita, known in Greek as Hippos. Well, I can't see their comments. Known as Hippos. And it is on a hill. It is in the Golan, but this part of the Golan was actually controlled by Israel even before the Six-Day War. So in ancient times, in 2,000 years ago, this was part of the Decapolis, or the 10 big cities in Israel and today's Jordan. One of the most famous one is Bet Shan, or used to be called Skytopolis in northern Israel, and also Amman is another one, by the way, in Jordan. So this is on top of a hill. Just down here is actually the Kinneret, where my arrow is on the top, the Kinneret, and the Galil on the other side. So this is on top of Kibbutz En Gev, on the eastern side of the Kinneret. That's a famous kibbutz where Teddy Kollek was a member of, the former mayor of Jerusalem. And just behind En Gev, there's a road that says you're forbidden to go up unless you're an agricultural vehicle. So of course, all the Israeli tour guides go up there because we all suddenly find our cars are agricultural vehicles. And we go up in the middle of this hill on the way up to the Golan is a national park, actually called Susita, which is Israel's most inaccessible national park with no infrastructure at all, not even a toilet. And basically you have an entire amazing city from the Roman period, later the Byzantine period. There are many churches. This is just the remains of one of the Byzantine churches over here. There's about 5 or 6 churches. There are some synagogue remains that have yet to be uncovered, a huge cardo, and just unbelievable remains, of which about 95% of it is still under the ground. So that's number one. Let's go for number 2. We'll stay on the Golan Heights.
Just before we go to your second and last recommendation, we'll give a shout out to James Carlil, who happens to be Brand's dad, who recognized Susita.
Okay, excellent. I'm very impressed. Even people who've been to Israel hundreds of times don't usually recognize Susita because they haven't been there. All right, let's go to number 2. Here we go. This is one of the newest national parks in Israel.
It can be so many places that I give up before I even start.
Okay. Can you read any of the comments? Anyone want to take a guess here?
No, not many guesses.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll put you out of your misery. This is a place we don't actually know its name, believe it or not. In Arabic, it's called El Kanateh, which means a mother of archers. And in Hebrew, it's called Kshatot, similar name, the mother of archers. And this is actually in the Ramat Golan, in the Golan Heights. It's a Bet Knesset, it's a synagogue from the time of the Talmud, from the time of the Gemara, so about the 5th century or so. And what's amazing about this is we're seeing it now in amazing condition. This is the entire first floor with the Aron Kodesh, with the Ark and the door facing Jerusalem and all the pillars. But when this was first uncovered well, it was briefly identified about 100 years ago, but after 67, they did an archaeological survey of the Golan Heights, and they found a pile of rubble in the southern Golan Heights. And they realized that under this pile of rubble is a Bet Knesset, a synagogue, which was destroyed in that 8th century earthquake, but all the pieces were still there. So normally what happens in Israel is when later powers come, they take the stones for secondary use or tertiary use. But because this was in such an isolated valley, after it had collapsed, no one bothered, taking the stones. They were all there. So along comes the University of Bar-Ilan, does a survey, and does this amazing thing where they put drilled small holes, put computer chips inside every single stone, scanned the entire area, and using a massive crane that's usually used in a shipbuilding yard, computer-controlled crane, they actually went and reconstructed the entire synagogue with the original pieces, like a huge Lego set. It took them years to do. And when you go in, you see that all of the pieces, they have letters and numbers on where they're identified. So when they first found this place a couple of decades ago, it was literally a pile of rubble. And I would go back with groups year after year after year and watch them slowly rebuilding it. And eventually they stopped when they got the entire first floor of it and opened it to the public about on Sukkot 2 years ago. It's called En Kshatot. Well worth a visit. There's an amazing synagogue and also the village itself outside, which is now, as we talk, being excavated, and a beautiful spring as well.
Great.
So there are 2 sites.
A shout out to Gary Hertz, by the way, who got it right.
Right, because most people are, I've been to it a million times, been there, seen that, done it, bought the t-shirt, got the hat, and here we are. There's no end of places to discover and visit in Israel.
Good on you for getting 2 places that I didn't recognize. I've traveled all over Israel a million times since I can remember myself. Good on you.
Photograph later.
Now I'll give you an even harder task. I'll ask you a question, and as a tour guide, you have to answer in very few words. So what I'll ask you is for 3 places you'll recommend us to eat in Israel, 1 in Tel Aviv, 1 in Jerusalem, and 1 in Haifa. That is, in my opinion, by far the best city in Israel. Happens to be my hometown, but I'm not biased. But just very quickly, name what do we eat there, where is it? And then afterwards, 1 place which is very popular, but in your opinion is a terrible tourist trap.
Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Yerushalayim. Okay. So, I wasn't expecting that question, so I'll do it very quickly. Okay, so we'll start with Yerushalayim, because that's the easy one. I'm probably going to mention a place that very few have heard of, but I love going there with groups. It surprises them. By the way, I do not get percentages. This is not a advert, but it happens to be an off the beaten track place. It's in the Russian compound in Jerusalem. It's called Migrash Orsi, the Russian compound. There's a small little restaurant. It's actually below street level called Darna. D-A-R-N-A. It's a Moroccan restaurant. Not only is the food Moroccan, the guy who built it himself was Moroccan and brought all of the furniture and all the fittings from Morocco. So you go onto the ground and suddenly you find yourself in Morocco with the Moroccan tiles and Moorish designs, and even the waiters and waitresses wear Moroccan costume and music, and the food tastes just like you're in North Africa. So it's called the Dana restaurant. And for me, that is just like pretty unbelievable in the Russian compound. Right. So in Tel Aviv, definitely what they call a room with a view. There's another restaurant called 2C. It's on top of the round Dizengoff Tower, Azrieli Tower, sorry. There's the round one, there's a triangle one, and the square one. On top of the round one, there's a place called 2C, where you go all the way to the top. The food is French food, cordon bleu, which basically looks very nice, but not a lot of it, but it's very tasty. But you go there for the view. You can literally see on a clear day from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea and all of Tel Aviv underneath you. It's a spectacular location. Which moves us on to Haifa. Now, this is going to be a bit of trouble here because Sefi lives there. But I would, if I was in Haifa, the first thing I would do is I would leave it and I would go to the Druze villages near Haifa in the Carmel, especially to Dalit al-Carmel, and just have some of the street food there. It's absolutely amazing. Whenever my groups go and have the Druze home hospitality, they're just blown away by by everything, basically. So I would definitely go with some ethnic Druze food, and we like the Druze as well, and they like us.
Specifically, I would recommend a restaurant called Tabun Zaman. It has 2 branches, one in Usfia, one in Dalit El Carmel. On the Carmel, really, really good.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked me if they were kosher. I can see it's a commentary. Yeah, they're all kosher. Yeah. It used to be in Tel Aviv, you'd have to really make an effort to find a kosher place, but now more and more places are kosher. So all those places I mentioned are kosher and tasty. That's not mutually exclusive. Okay. Next.
I'll, by the way, mention in Haifa, one place which is a lot of tourists go. It's in every tour guide, in every tourist recommendation book, but it's really good. It's called Fatouche in the German colony. Really good when you combine it with the location. Really worth a visit. It's called Fatouche. And then Tuvia, please, one place that people tend to go all the time and you think it's a tourist trap to be avoided.
Yeah, you know, just like you were telling us earlier on that you'd send people to Old Jaffa and just say, you know, enjoy yourself. I'll meet you there in half an hour. So for me, it's definitely Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem. I just like, okay, guys, I'll see you in half an hour. And they just go and have overpriced falafel and food, and especially a lot of American Jews. For them, that's Jerusalem, that's Israel, Ben Yehuda Street. But you can definitely do a lot better than that, including just off Ben Yehuda Street at the bottom, and Nachalat Shiva, at the bottom of Ben Yehuda Street, there's a wonderful place called Tmol Shilshom, and a little alleyway with books and beautiful vegetarian and dairy stuff. But yeah, definitely the cheesy Ben Yehuda tourist trap is not for me.
Yes. And I would add to that Dr. Shakshuka in Jaffa.
Mm-hmm.
Tourists love it. I think it's, send me an email, I'll host you for Shakshuka. Much better, 5% of the price. Okay, so Tuvia, the last thing we'll get to at the very end of this session, after we jump to speak about birthright now, and then we'll come to, and maybe you can share a link or two on how people can connect virtually with Israel in those times. For example, like the webcams that show you the Kotel 24/7, but we'll get to it at the very end of this session. So now we'll jump to the second thing that is fascinating about you. And this is the fact that you've been leading groups of Taglit, Birthright, since the program has started. And you also wrote an interesting research about it, about the effect that Taglit Birthright has actually on the Israeli participants. So I'll ask to start from the top. I'm not sure if all of our participants know what Taglit Birthright is. Give us a general quick overview about it. How does it work? How many people have participated since it started? And how many have you done? And generally about the effectiveness of the program on the diaspora Jews who participate in it.
Okay, so Birthright, wow, that's a good one. I could talk about this one for days, but Birthright started in 1999 as a concept. I was actually one of the first 3 guides that guided Birthright trips when they brought in these 3 pilot trips. So I'm probably one of the only, if not the only guide that's been guiding Birthright since its inception back in 1999. And basically the idea was to understand the numbers, that Judaism was the only monotheistic faith in numerical decline. That meant whilst every year there was more Christians and more Muslims and more basically of every religion in the world, there was less Jews. Not because we were being physically killed, as in the time of the Shoah, but rather there was such apathy, there was mass assimilation amongst the Jewish community, where most people were just, a lot of people, like in America, had gone up to 70%, were saying, you know what, we just want to be like everybody else. So the Jewish educators and educational theorists said, well, what is it? Like, what's going on over here? For so many years, we managed to survive for the reasons you heard about on my little Masada clip, because we had our shared faith, our shared community, and our attachment to Israel. And now we're just basically killing ourselves. It's crazy. So they came up with the idea. It was basically the brainchild of a few different people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, of let's get this attachment to Israel reignited. And how do we do that? We're going to take people in their most impressionable age and university age, and we're going to bring them to Israel for free for 10 days. So everyone initially, especially because they were Jews, what's the catch? What do you mean? There's no such thing as a free lunch. And the organizer said, yes, we're going to give you a 10-day trip with not just diaspora Jews, but also to meet Israeli peers as well. In Hebrew, that's called the mifgash, or cross-cultural peer education. And we're going to take children, students from the diaspora, and they'll spend 10 days in Israel. Half of those trips will also be with Israeli peers as well. So there was a lot of cynical reaction initially. People are like, what's that going to do? You're going to take a bunch of wealthy kids from the diaspora, throw them in Israel for 10 days, and they're all going to come back and go, I believe, I see the light, yes. And there was a lot of research done. I'm just going to quote one research, and that was a university called Brandeis University. So they have something called the Cohen Center, and they basically decided they were going to follow 500 birthright participants of the initial bunch who started going back in the year 2000. And they took either participants who either belonged to reform communities or non-affiliated. And they did a longitudinal study where they took 500 who went, and they followed them for the next 10 years to see what impact those 10 days had on their life. Now, as a control group, which you always need as an academia would understand, they took 500 participants who did not go on a birthright trip. Now, the results were so startling and surprising and unexpected that they actually made it to the Wall Street Journal. And basically, the 500 who didn't go to Israel, when it came time for them to choose a life partner, about the numbers were 70%, 69 to 70% of them married out of the faith, which might sound shocking, but those are the numbers in the United States. About 70 marriages are mixed faith marriages, 70% of the marriages. Of those who went on that 10-day trip to Israel, they didn't all come back and start keeping kosher or go to synagogue services or make aliyah to Israel IDF. Well, some of them did, the vast majority didn't. But those 10 days impacted them so much that when it came time to choose a life partner, a whopping 72% of them chose to marry someone of the Jewish faith. So for all the cynics and the birthright initially, they could see those 10 days made such an impact on the diaspora participants that they wanted to be part of the chain of Jewish continuity and to carry on and not to break that link going all the way back for thousands of years. So that's the impact of birthright. It's probably the greatest single experiment in Jewish continuity, successful experiment in the last couple of decades, and well worth all the money invested in it.
Yeah. So as we have only 10 minutes left, I'll skip one interesting question that we maybe keep for later, but I'll tell you that you've mentioned the Mifgash. Everyone speaks about the soldiers who participated in it. I participated in it as a uni student in Israel. So luckily for me, I speak pretty fluent Spanish that I've learned when I traveled in South America. And there aren't many people who speak Spanish, and the soldiers who speak Spanish go to so many birthright trips because they need soldiers who speak Spanish. So they were very happy to send me when I was in uni. And I joined the group of Argentinians for 10 days. It was fascinating for me to see how they view Israel, but also to learn a lot about diaspora Jews, because I say it all the time, it's painful fact. People in Israel don't know and barely care about diaspora Jews. So I think the most interesting thing that came out of it for me was that one person in the group that became my best friend at a certain point, he never went to a shul in his life until he went on birthright. He wasn't circumcised. He wasn't brought up Jewish at all. He only came because it was a free trip. Now he lives in Israel with his Israeli wife and Israeli kid. That's the success of this program on my small story. But you've done a much bigger research. Maybe tell us a bit about the research that you've done.
Okay, great. So first of all, you can all see this picture over here in the background, all right? Can you see it, Sefi? Can you see the photo
Yes.
on the screen? All right, so this is a blended birthright group. This is both the 8 soldier participants who've joined us and the regular North American trip. We're sitting here in the Lone Soldier Center in honor of Michael Levine, Zecha Livracha, Merkaz L'Chaylim Bodedim in Jerusalem. They also have centers in Haifa and Tel Aviv as well, and Beersheba. And you can see here quite clearly there are Israelis and there are American kids, North American kids. Now you can tell in this picture who's who because the Israelis have all seemed to chose the same color for some strange reason, which is olive green, the colors of the IDF. Now the Mifgash, or the meeting, has both IDF soldiers and people who finish the army or in university, like when Sefi went, university students, or people doing civilian national service. But my particular research for my PhD was only on soldiers. So I was always doing research whilst I was guiding on soldiers and the way, because until my research, everyone wanted to know how birthright impacted the diaspora participants. That's what the donors wanted to know. That's what the federations wanted to know. And if you talk about sheer numbers, well over 600,000 Jews have been on birthright from the ages of 18 to 26, and over 100,000 IDF soldiers. Now, a lot of the research...
That also answers Mandy's question about, was it only about the affiliated? There are so many young Jews who went on birthright that it's way beyond the affiliated. So it will be back to you.
Yeah, all you need to have is one Jewish parent. So it could be from either side, and you get people who barely know they're Jewish. I've had people who being Jewish is just an accident of birth. I remember I was once in a synagogue in Sfat, one of the old synagogues in the old city, and I just said out of curiosity, before I start talking about this particular synagogue, how many of you is the first time you're in a synagogue? And out of a group of 40 participants, 14 of them, 1/4, never set foot over the threshold of a synagogue, not even on Yom Kippur, not even for Bar Mitzvah. This was literally at the age of 24, 25, the first synagogue they'd ever been in. So I had to go back to do Synagogue 101 as opposed to a more detailed thing. What's that thing sticking out in the middle? So yes, you have people right across the spectrum from non-affiliated to affiliated. But I'd say the overwhelming majority of people who I guide are non-affiliated or marginally or loosely affiliated. Which makes it even more impressive what impact those 10 days can have on their life. So back to the soldiers. So initially when birthright started, there wasn't Israeli component. It was just a bunch of diaspora students touring Israel. And along came the guy who used to be the head of the IDF education corps, called the General Elazar Stern. And his idea was, wait a second, we can make this a mutual learning experience. In addition to diaspora Jews learning about Israel, we can also have Israelis learning about diaspora Jews as well. So he proposed the idea of serving soldiers initially joining these birthright groups. And so what they did is they took 8 soldiers for each 40 birthright group, took them through training, a little bit of training, made sure their English was okay. They selected soldiers who were either from real quality units, either top combat units or intelligence, or people really who understood that their mission wasn't just to go and have fun with these kids, but also they were their shlichim, or as messengers from Israel, explaining about Israel to the diaspora Jews. What actually ended up happening is I spoke to Elazar Stern, like anything else in Israel, even if you're a general, Israel's a very informal society. I just met him at a friend's wedding, and I said to him, you know, you've got all these soldiers who you sent on birthright, 100,000 of them, they all go. What have you learned from it? He says, to tell you the truth, we don't actually have a budget. So after they go to the birthright, they just go back to the unit. So that's when my light bulb went off. I said, wait a second, let's switch it. All till now, the research has been on the impact on their diaspora students. How are the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers, been impacted on it? So I proposed this as a doctoral thesis, and it was accepted. And I asked them 3 basic questions. How does meeting diaspora Jews affect them as Israeli Jews, their Israeli identity, their Jewish identity? How does it affect their sense of service in the army? And how does it affect their opinions of diaspora Jews? Because the one subject that's not taught, considered too controversial in school in Israel, is they don't really learn about American Jews or diaspora Judaism. They learn about American culture. You know, if you see these guys out of uniform, you can't even tell which one's Israeli and which one's American or Australian, because they look the same. They hear the same music, they follow the same sports, they have the same culture, but so they know a lot about American culture. They just don't know about American Jews. In Israel, most Jews are either observant or non-observant. There's very little shades in the middle. It's black or white. The Orthodox synagogue is the one you don't go to. There is liberal Judaism, but it's very, very small and not really well publicized. And so you have a situation when you have these Israelis meeting a non-affiliated Jews for the first time from the diaspora. And for example, like any Jew who's been to a youth movement will know the songs, like for the Birkat Hamazon, for the benching with all the movements and the la la la's and everything. And they say the words and don't understand them. You have the secular Israelis who understand the words but don't say them. And you have this incredible meeting of cultures. So because we're running pretty short on time, I'll just jump straight to the conclusions of my research.
Yes, we have 2 minutes.
Yes, which is basically the Israeli soldiers themselves are blown away by diaspora Jewry. They didn't realize the richness and the diversity of pluralistic Judaism, because in Israel, as I mentioned, either Orthodox or non-Orthodox, with liberal Judaism coming a very distant time, whereas they meet these very excited, passionate Jews who grew up in the liberal or former conservative movement, and it opens their mind as well to different aspects of Judaism. And most importantly, they have a much more sense of Judaism, and their Israeli identity comes out much stronger with their meeting with diaspora Jews. Because you have to ask most Israeli soldiers, what do you do that's Jewish? They'll say, oh, we speak Hebrew, we live in Israel, and we serve in the army. That could also be answered by a Druze soldier as well, who also speaks Hebrew, serves in the army, lives in Israel, but it doesn't make him Jewish. So quite often, when they meet these kids who grew up in a non-Jewish majority culture, they need to ask themselves the question, what is it about my life that is Jewish? And I've had soldiers who are very non-affiliated who said, oh, you know what, no big deal if I marry someone who's not Jewish, as long as I love them. And they meet these diaspora kids and see the problems of assimilation and lack of connection, and it makes them feel stronger Jews as well as prouder Israelis, in a nutshell, of a 400-page thesis.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tuvia. It's fascinating, and we can speak about it for hours. And obviously now, no one can travel from Australia to Israel. Maybe you can stop the screen for a second. So no one can obviously, right. So no one can travel from Australia to Israel, including not birthright groups, but in general, the ZFA is the Australian operator of the Taglit Birthright. So you're more than welcome to visit the website to learn more about it. There are so many things that we haven't gotten into. For example, your recommendations for how to virtually connect with Israel. We'll have to meet again, I guess. תודה רבה, טוביה, and back to you.
Sefi and Tuvia, thank you so much for that. Sefi, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to tell everyone that the ZFA is, of course, the proud partner of both Taglit Birthright Israel and the Masa Israel Journey programs. And in a normal year, the ZFA would send about 600 or even more young adults to Israel through these programs. Obviously, we're looking forward to doing so again once it's safe to do so, and of course in a COVID-safe manner. And if you don't know what Masa is, or if you want to find out more either about Masa Israel Journey or Birthright and the opportunities that they represent to young Australians or young Jewish Australians, I would urge you to Google ZFA and Masa or ZFA and Birthright. You'll find what you're looking for, and then go from there and explore some options. Before I say goodbye to Tuvia and Sefi, I do want to remind you once again that next week we will be speaking to Jordana Cutler, the head of policy for Israel and the Jewish diaspora at Facebook. However, in the meantime, have a great week. Tuvia, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your photos. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And Sefi, again, thank you. A very precious part of your life is happening right now, and yet you took an hour out of it to speak to us. So thank you all. Have a great week. Keep washing those hands, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Thanks.